all of this means for social change in the Arab region. I'm hoping that this can be a session in which we do take that step back or step up to look beyond the details of particular cases at what it tells us about the topic for this session, which is, what are the differences between emerging civil society activism and participation in policy and those that might have constituted the generations of civil activism that came before them. And it's a very interesting way to segue into the discussion of what are the big picture takeaways that we as a collective research group have from this multi-year project. So I'm going to ask the speakers to be as synthetic and big picture as they can while they give us examples from their research that make the points they'd like to make. And also, because we're in such a special moment right as we sit in Beirut today in the Arab region, where Arab Spring 2.0 or the next wave or whatever you want to call it is happening all around us. And I think it's hard sometimes for us to get accurate and important and informed insight about what's going on the ground. I'm going to ask each speaker to take 1 minute at the beginning to tell us one thing about the current situation in their country where they sit that we might not be aware of or that will help us to understand the current state of civil society activism. And we're going to begin in Kuwait with Sharifa El Adwani. She is an assistant professor of political science in the Department of International Relations. She directs the Center for Gulf Studies at the American University of Kuwait. She's written for a number of publications both in the Gulf, in Europe, and elsewhere. She teaches courses on Kuwait foreign policy, international law and organizations. She publishes on politics and women in the Middle East and on methods. So Sharifa, can you respond to my 2 requests? One thing about what's going on these days in Kuwait, and what are your takeaways from your case study about past and emerging forms of activism? I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, well, I actually addressed both in my paper, but I'll go ahead and not let that be a mystery. In Kuwait right now, about a month ago, we had a protest in front of Parliament against corruption. So that will be addressed in the talk. And then when it comes to some big takeaways, something I would like for us to think about are those that are kind of the unseen marginalized, and I will be ending my talk with that.
Wonderful. Go right ahead.
Okay, good afternoon. I'd like to greet my friends and colleagues and esteemed guests of faculty, staff, students, and community members, and give a special thanks to Fatma Moussaoui and Nasser Yassin for bringing us all together under extraordinary circumstances. I'm so pleased to be presenting alongside my colleagues Daniel Tavana, Abdullah Al-Khanani, and Abdul Azim Jabr Hafid. And it is truly excellent to have Barbara Ibrahim moderate our session. I wish I could be there in person, but to use a phrase from reality TV, the tribe has spoken. Please accept my best wishes for your continued safety. My presentation today will discuss some of the formal and informal structural and topical differences and similarities between relatively developing civil societies in GCC or Gulf countries and relatively entrenched civil societies in other Arab states such as Lebanon and Egypt. The GCC or Gulf countries' civil society activism, much like their formal statehood, is relatively emergent compared to those communities in other Arab countries such as Lebanon or Egypt. Indeed, negotiation and bargaining over the distribution of power was the modus operandi among state elites in early GCC formal statehood history. Equal rights was a conversation among the wealthy, the well-connected, the well-known, and the men. Over the years, more and more denizens, elite and ordinary men and women, began to participate in the civil society arena. The conversations are not only about decreasing the disparity of rights between and within individuals and groups, but for new rights, for more rights. It is this participation of a diverse population in civil society that allows for the beginnings of its crystallization as a civil society, rather than simply an exclusionary discussion among elites. The possibility of minority inclusivity is a necessary condition. Other definitional aspects of the civil society arena, characterized by Kuwait University sociologist Ezraibi, is one that is organized, institutionalized, voluntary, consensual, with value-oriented goals, and a sense of independence from the state. It is this last characteristic, the autonomous nature of civil society, which is complicated in spaces whereby there is a long history of non-mutually exclusive nature of public and private. The history of convergence between the political and the personal is one that is shared across the Middle East and is certainly found in our civil societies. Thus, structurally, civil society across the Middle East share many similarities in this regard, be they in the form of formal organizations or in the form of informal groups. Formal and independent civil society organizational establishment has been highly regulated, leading to challenges in these organizations' abilities to address policy reform. In Saudi Arabia, the 2015-16 Law on Associations and Foundations still involves a great amount of government restrictions and allows for the prospect of state intervention. Tetrail 1993 noted the blurring of boundaries between the state and civil society in Kuwait. In Bahrain, the formal registration of civil society organizations is not always approved by higher public bodies, such as the requisite Ministry of Social Development, particularly if the organization is human rights centric. These registrational and functional obstacles can be challenging to overcome without persistence and creativity. In Lebanon, soft balancing tactics, particularly that of delay, is employed by governmental bodies in their response to attempted CSO registration under the Law of Associations. Egypt's Law 70 of 2017 for regulating the work of associations has led to criminalizing some NGO actions, freezing the assets of human rights organizations and detaining activists. While a new Law 149 of 2019 on the law of regulating the work of civil associations has repealed much of the 2017 law's measures, other measures have remained, and generalized legal language potentially empowers the regime vis-à-vis organizations. The commonality is that the agency of these organizations may be stunted through its position subordinate to and accountable to the state and its interests. Operating in a continuous structured format outside the state framework has been challenging in many countries in the region. In Lebanon, secret associations are illegal. Unregistered organizations in Egypt are prohibited, and unregistered societies in Jordan are illegal under the Penal Code, Law 16 of 1960. The GCC states have similar policies regarding unregistered civil society organizations. Working under restrictive formal structures extracts costs from the organizations and its participants, particularly the costs of commitment, time, and labor. In order to align with regulatory conditions, many organizations rely on creative strategies, tactics, and partnerships when pushing for reform. For example, Bosch et al. 2019 points to the use of nanomedia, such as meetings, drama, art, and poetry as creative strategies used in Egypt for awareness, education, and information. Egyptian CSOs have also used crowdfunding to replace restricted international foreign funding. In Lebanon today, song and dance reinforces the peaceful unity of the protesters, and protesters share memes that enhance crowd morale through both humor and national and shared symbology. While it's important to note the involvement of the public sector in these organizations, contemporaneously, it should be noted that these human rights-centric organizations do not always reflect the needs and/or desires of the populace. They may be pushing for an international or a limited or an exclusionary agenda. These dubitable organizational motivations may be reasons why, particularly in times of crisis, when rapid, incisive reform is needed, interested peoples coalesce into loosely aligned informal groups to push for change. Therefore, informal, or sometimes ad hoc groups, coalesce to target issue-specific policy for reform. In instances at the nexus of national critical junctures and individualized, personalized impact, the collective action problem may be overcome through the use of telecommunicative interconnectivity and later surmounted through social media. Informed participants are galvanized and perform observable action on the ground, although not always to the benefit of the involved activists or not always to the benefit of society at large. Kuwait's Nabina Hamsa movement, coordinated in part through the blogosphere, was successful in achieving reform, but yielded unpredictable externalities that are still present today. Saudi Arabia's seemingly disparate but unified goal-oriented campaign on women's right to drive featured social media shared videos of female activists driving cars. Again, while ultimately successful in obtaining its goals, several activists have encountered backlash that has impacted their personal security. There are strong echoes of this in Bahrain as well. In response to these less tractable informal groups, governments in the Middle East have passed new or clarified top-down restrictions on civil rights. The reactionary responses, however, often do not address the root-level issues motivating people's collective action, implying, optimistically, that the people will find new ways of bringing their grievances to the fore. Here, the importance of nanomedia's role in normalizing the domestic and international salience and attention of these issues has been critical. Civil action issue areas that have gained international attention in the Middle East also share topical similarities, but different countries have different priorities. In Lebanon, Algeria, and Egypt, large crowds gathered to call on elites and leaders to leave their public positions due to economic inequalities, unemployment, and lack of economic opportunities. Elites in the public sphere are also being questioned about their involvement in economic practices. At multiple levels in the public sector, such as various ministries and branches of government, allegations of elite corruption, fasad, are gaining momentum. In Iraq today, young protesters demand to know where the oil money is being spent. In Lebanon today, anti-corruption protesters are pushing for asset disclosure, a decrease in public waste, and seek justice for those in government that have illicitly enriched themselves. Hundreds in Kuwait protested against perceived fiscal malfeasance in front of the parliament, stating, "That's enough," less than 1 month ago. Also consistently obtaining international attention over many decades is the issue area of women's rights. Norton highlighted the regional trend of pushing women's issues to the fore, from voting in Bahrain and Kuwait to driving in Saudi Arabia to fighting against domestic violence in Lebanon to reclaiming their bodies as their own in Egypt. Importantly, with women's issues, obtainment of suffrage does not indicate attainment of a quote-unquote complete set of rights. In multiple social, cultural, economic, and legal arenas, women do not possess the same opportunity or the same ideational and material privilege as their male counterparts. As a result, multiple formal organizations and informal groups have addressed reform of certain rights in a piecemeal fashion, such as women's health, harassment, and status, and gaining small successes and then moving on to new items to address as the battles continue. One of the most challenging areas of reform is that of policies, laws, and norms pertaining to the family. Multiplicities of juridical sources, primarily those of theological jurisprudence, hinder the addressment of focal issues within states such as Lebanon, Egypt, Jordan, and several of the Gulf countries. Addressment of these issues necessitates coordination across several authorities in both the public and the private sphere, requiring resources that may not always be available to civil society organizations or informal groups. Yet negotiations persist in these spheres daily, with not all negotiations being of overt protest, formal litigation, and high media exposure. As Bayat 2013 notes, everyday non-social movements occur through the power of presence and the normalizing of routine. In other words, when the marginalized are seen and integrated into everyday life, the marginalized must be acknowledged as having a role in society, making enfranchisement obvious to political authorities. Here, seeing is understanding. We see women in the workplace, we see the youth, we see the physically disabled, we see the displaced. At the same time, much of the marginalized can be hidden. Persons with invisible disabilities, the elderly, persons with mental health disorders, and the undocumented are not always able to obtain access to the various centers of societal power, be they elite or everyday, for a variety of reasons.
Sharifa, if you could see me, you'd see that I was holding up a 2-minute card.
Oh, I didn't. Okay.
Okay.
All right, I'm almost done. Okay. It's perhaps these groups that have the largest obstacles: overcoming stigma, collective action problems, mobility issues, and building sustainable communities to allow the momentum for reform to persist. To conclude, civil society in the Middle East persists in increasing autonomy and agency for individuals and groups. New generations with more complex understandings of human rights and human security are being folded into the fabric of society, and they often outpace the rapid response of those in power. Underlying this tenacity are common values across groups in the Middle East: dedication, accountability, and justice. Thank you all for generously including me in your conference.
Once again, I urge those of you who haven't to be sure to read these papers, because no one has been able to present all of the analysis and the ideas that they have managed to uncover in these case studies. So apologies for closing you off, Sharifa. Thank you very much. Now we're going to turn to Iraq, and our speaker is what in the United States we would call a pracademic. She is a writer and a researcher who's also very active in the civil society sphere. Dr. Sahar Harbi is a political advisor and communications manager at the Iraqi Ministry of Education. But she's also a member of Tarbawiyun, I hope I'm saying that right, Association, a member of the Iraqi Women's Association, a member of Dialogue for Development Forum, and has written many books on issues of education and, very interestingly for us, ethnic diversity. So I'll turn it over to you.
السلام عليكم جميعا سيداتي وسادتي الحضور، والشكر اسمحوا لي أن أقدم شكري الجزيل لإدارة هذا المؤتمر المهم. واسمحوا لي بالبداية أن أعقب على أن المجتمع المدني في العراق هو ليس مجتمعاً ناشئاً صراحة. المجتمع العراقي المدني موجود ما قبل تأسيس الدولة العراقية الحديثة عام 1921. فمواصفات المجتمع المدني أو أغلبها كما في تلك الحقبة كانت موجودة في المنتديات الثقافية والاجتماعية والاقتصادية. نذكر منها على سبيل المثال ما كان يقوم به الأب أنستانس الكرملي في اجتماع كل جمعة، يجتمع وجهاء المناطق ويتداولون السبل التي يمكن بها تحسين الأوضاع في المنطقة، كذلك الشعراء والأدباء. ثم نأتي ما بعد الاستقلال في عام 1921، يعني على عجالة أذكر أنه إحنا في عام 1952 هناك نقابة للأطباء، 1924 هناك نادي العلوية، 1959 نقابة المهندسين، 1963 نقابة المعلمين، 1933 نقابة المحامين. إذن المجتمع المدني في العراق وليس مجتمعا ناشئا. نعم، بعد العهد الملكي وعسكرة المجتمع لحد عام 2003 كان هناك ركود وانكماش لمؤسسات المجتمع المدني أو المجتمع المدني بشكل عام، عادي لأنه كل المجتمع المدني قابله مجتمع عسكري أو يعني فماكو مجال. المساحة المخصصة للمجتمع المدني استغلتها المؤسسة العسكرية، حتى أنها استغلت حتى الأطفال في مرحلة ابتدائية في ما يسمى بالقلايا. نعم، ننتقل إلى البحث الخاص اللي قدمته بخصوص مؤسسات المجتمع المدني ونضالها وحراكها للدفاع عن قانون الأحوال الشخصية العراقي لعام 1959، والذي يعد مفخرة من مفاخر القوانين العراقية، إذ إنه يمكن تطبيقه على جميع الأديان والطوائف، وهو أحد ركائز الوحدة الوطنية العراقية. فاستهدف هذا القانون منذ عام 2003 من قبل الأحزاب السياسية الدينية. حاولت مؤسسات المجتمع المدني النسوية تحديداً التصدي لهذه المحاولات. على عجالة يعني أحب أقول لكم أن قانون الأحوال المدنية لعام 1959 قانون يحمي المرأة، يحمي الزوجة، يحمي الأسرة ويحمي الطفل، وفيه ضمانات كثيرة للزوجة، منها على سبيل المثال أنه يحق للزوجة بعد الطلاق أن تبقى في بيت الزوجية متى شاءت، كما أنه يحدد سن الزواج ب 18 سنة. إضافة إلى ذلك أنه لا يسمح لأي أحد من الأقارب عقد الزواج ما لم يكن هناك يعني شرعية في ذلك. الاستهداف الأول لهذا القانون كان في عام 2003، تحديداً القرار رقم 137 الذي أصدره مجلس الحكم لإلغاء هذا القانون والاستعاضة عنه بإعادة العمل بالقضاء المذهبي. وهذا طبعاً شيء غريب، لأنه عادة الدولة يعني تسند القوانين التي تحمي حقوق المواطن وتشد أطراف الدولة وتشد المواطنين إليها، إلا أنه من الغريب تقديم مثل هذا القرار الذي يقوض الوحدة الوطنية ويقوض العلاقة بين المواطن ودولته ورعاياها. فعملت مؤسسات المجتمع المدني طبعا في هذا المجال، سنتحدث عن تفاصيلها فيما بعد، لإلغاء هذا القرار عام 2004. الاستهداف الثاني كان في دستور جمهورية العراق الدائم الذي صدر عام 2005 تحديدا في المادة 41. طبعا هذا الدستور مليء بالتناقضات. مادة 41 تعيد الأحوال الشخصية للعراقيين إلى انتماءاتهم الدينية والطائفية والعرقية، وهو طبعا بداية هو نقيض للمادة 14 التي تنص على أن العراقيين متساوون أمام القانون. الحراك المدني كان نشطا في هذا المجال أيضا، وعمل على جعل هذه المادة باعتبارها مادة خلافية، وأوقف العمل بها لحين تعديل الدستور. للأسف هذه المادة صحيح أوقف العمل بها، إلا أنه اجتماعيا كانت هناك حالات تصل إلى المحاكم العراقية، تصل بعد أن يعقد رجل الدين العقد الشرعي خارج إطار المحكمة، يأتي بعد سنوات بعد أن يكون هناك أولاد يأتي ليصدق على هذا العقد، فتبدأ هنا المشاكل. من المشاكل التي تسببت بذلك هو أنه حالات زواج الطفلات، وكذلك أنه بعض العشائر لم تعد تعترف بالطلاق الذي خارج الطلاق اللي بالمحكمة، وبالتالي المحكمة تعد بعض النساء مطلقات بينما عشائريا تعتبرها إلى الآن متزوجة. الحالة هي طبعا حالات كثيرة من مساوئ كثيرة لهذا التصرف، إلا أنه هاي أهمها وجود وفيات من الأمهات الصغيرات، إذ أنه يعني حتى واحد يقدم على الزواج في المحكمة يقدم شهادة طبية وتحليل دم وكذا تحاليل، إلا أنه من يكون عقد خارج أطر الزواج هذا ما يكون هذا السيستم نهائيا موجود، وبالتالي لدينا حالات كثيرة من وفاة الأمهات الصغيرات. الاستهداف الثالث كان في عام 2014 تحديدا من قبل وزير العدل، الذي ينتمي طبعا إلى أحد الأحزاب الدينية، الذي طرح قانونا بديلا عن قانون الأحوال المدنية الموحد، طرح قانون الأحوال المدنية الجعفري أي على المذهب الجعفري. وبصراحة أثار ضجة كبيرة هذا القانون، هو مشروع قانون أصلا يعني كان في حينها. جمعيات مثل أذكر على سبيل المثال من المؤسسات المجتمع المدني الفاعلة في هذا المجال هي جمعية أمل العراقية وتحالف نساء الرافدين وشبكة نساء عراقيات، وحوالي أكثر من 35 منظمة و88 شخصية حكومية وأكاديمية وإعلامية تصدت لهذا القانون، والحمد لله يعني أوقف العمل به أو ألغي. لا يفوتني أن أذكر أنه بعض رجال الدين المتنورين وقفوا إلى جانب قضية المؤسسات المجتمع المدني في نضالهم ضد حماية هذا القانون. يعني مو كل رجال الدين بصراحة كانوا موافقين على هذه المقترحات. الاستراتيجيات التي اتبعتها مؤسسات المجتمع المدني يمكن إيجازها: أولاً توظيف وسائل الإعلام والتحركات الاجتماعية، تقديم مذكرات إلى الحكومة، والأهم من ذلك استغلال أو استعمال أنه هاي الفترة كانت تقديم تقرير عن العراق إلى لجنة سيداو، فذهب وفد من مؤسسات المجتمع المدني وقدم هذه التقارير بخصوص المادة 41 من دستور جمهورية العراق وبخصوص قانون الأحوال الشخصية الجعفري. فكان من توصيات هذه اللجنة وفي جلسات علنية في جنيف أنه تدعو الحكومة إلى إلغاء المادة 41 من دستور جمهورية العراق وسحب قانون الأحوال الشخصية الجعفري. كذلك استخدمت مؤسسات المجتمع المدني بذكاء مناسبة 8 آذار عيد المرأة، وقاموا بوقفة احتجاجية في شارع المتنبي وأمام مجلس النواب وفي الساحات التي تعتبر في بغداد وفي بعض المحافظات ساحات ثقافية من الفضاءات العامة التي يلجأ إليها العراقيون للتعبير عن آرائهم، ورفعوا شعار نساء العراق في حداد. بالنسبة للنتائج، طبعا النتائج في هذا تحديدا في هذا المجال كانت جيدة لا بأس بها. كان من نتائج هذا هو إسقاط القانون 137 لمجلس الحكم، إيقاف العمل بالمادة 41 من الدستور وجعلها من المواد الخلافية، سحب قانون الأحوال الشخصية الجعفري. طبعا لا ننكر فضل بعض السيدات الموجودات في البرلمان من النائبات، حقيقة يعني كان لهم دور مشهود به في هذا المجال. وخلال استبيان قمنا به على شبكات التواصل الاجتماعي طرحنا سؤال: الإنسان دون سن الرشد هل له القدرة على تكوين أسرة مستقرة وتربية أطفال؟ فكان من بين 194 متفاعل 84% لا أتفق، البقية كانت بين محايد وبين أتفق. السؤال الثاني كان وجود قانون مدني للأحوال الشخصية مثل القانون العراقي لعام 1959 هل هو أفضل من وجود قانون الأحوال الشخصية بحسب الأديان والمذاهب؟ طبعا كان من بين المتفاعلين 192 شخص، كان 78 أتفق، 18 محايد، 4 لا أتفق. ومن نتائج الاستبيان يتضح أنه مؤسسات المجتمع المدني في العراق على الأقل النسوية يعني تعمل بتجانس مع متطلبات المجتمع العراقي وما يريده المجتمع العراقي. لا ننسى في هذا المجال أنه هناك إلى الآن يعني محاولات مستمرة لتقويض هذا القانون، محاولات مستمرة لإلغائه في سعي حثيث. لا أفهم لماذا يعني إلى الآن أنا في سعي حثيث لتقويض أحد أركان الهوية الوطنية العراقية. يعني ما أعرف لماذا يحدث ذلك رغم أنه نحن جميعا بحاجة إلى مثل هذه القوانين. أشكر طبعا حسن استماعكم وأرجو أن لا أكون قد أثقلت على الوقت. شكرا جزيلا.
شكرا يا دكتورة. And thank you for reminding us that when we talk about emergent movements of civil society, we sometimes neglect a long history that was there before we were doing the kind of documentation that would make this widely known. So I think this is a really important point for us to keep in mind. Continuity within change. So now we turn to Daniel Havana. Daniel is a PhD candidate in the Department of Politics at Princeton University. He is a visiting fellow at the Paul Nietzsche School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins in Washington, D.C. His interests include a focus on elections, and I know he's been in Egypt to have a look at our debacles. That's a personal opinion, not his academic opinion. He writes also on identity, comparative political behavior, dynamics of political opposition in authoritarian regimes. He's had a number of important fellowships for his work. He's been published in a number of journals. He's written here for Lebanon Support, Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University, and he has been a research associate at POMED, which is a really important organization, if you're not familiar with it, giving weekly updates on the state of affairs of democracy promotion and transitions in Arab societies. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Daniel. Give us a word about Syria.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I want to thank everyone for coming today, especially the IFI organizers and staff and interns, and Fatima for all your hard work in getting all 100 of these case studies and all of us authors in one place. I've learned so much from all of you throughout this process, and I look forward to learning more. I also want to say a little bit about the kind of collaboration. You heard from Abdullah yesterday on Kuwait, and Abdullah and I have been working on these cases, these 4 cases that we've written together. And it's kind of, to me, working on these cases was a sign that often I think academic institutions or researchers and civil society activists or researchers on the ground don't collaborate enough. And so this was, I think, an example where it actually worked out pretty well. I hope Abdullah would agree. So today I want to use the case studies that Abdullah and I focused on to draw attention to specifically the participation of civil society movements and groups in electoral politics. My own academic research focuses on electoral behavior and political opposition in the Middle East and North Africa. Not surprisingly, of course, in most of these cases, elections are not totally free or fair. More often than not, they're used by incumbent systems, regimes, dictators to control and channel and manage dissent. And by this I mean elections are not always a mechanism for citizens to choose their leaders, but rather tools that regimes can use to channel different forms of political participation into formats that are tolerated and acceptable. And before I jump into that, I want to address Barbara's first question, which is one thing about your case that you want people to know. And this might seem strange to this audience, given that most of you have roots in the region. But usually when I talk about Kuwait, specifically to an American audience that doesn't really know much about the Middle East in general, or Kuwait in particular, I tell them Kuwait is kind of a lot like the US. And they kind of look at me funny and wonder why. But Kuwait, like the US, is a country of migrants. It's a country that is relatively new compared to many others. And it's a country where the kind of dominant social divisions, if you want to call them that, are based on geographic origin, kind of punctuated by sectarian or urban versus tribal differences. And so this is something I like to highlight about Kuwait, because I think in terms of the way Kuwait is often represented, most people don't really get to see or understand that. So back to the case. I'm going to try and focus only on one case today in my comments, so I can kind of do the stepping up and stepping beyond that Barbara has asked us to do. And I hope I'm able to do that. But I think the question of civil society participation in elections is an important one, and it's a question that I think the answer to which has changed a lot over time. Whether or not civil society should be involved in elections, whether or not civil society activists or civil society groups should aspire to power or aspire to rule, or whether it should play some other role. These are the kinds of questions that are foundational not only to civil society groups, but also to all electoral groups that participate in elections, I think, everywhere. So not surprisingly, I think in the Middle East and North Africa, the countries that are the focus of our cases, elections are not really seen as the first or even the primary space where political change is imagined, right? When you want to change something, usually the first place you don't think of is, well, I'm going to vote for this candidate in an election, or I'm going to run in an election, right? At least here in the Middle East and North Africa. Of course, what I'm saying, in many countries in the region, this doesn't even apply because there aren't elections, or elections are even more heavily restricted and controlled, such that there is no opposition, or there is no real alternative that's even allowed to participate. But if we zoom out of the Middle East for a second, there are lots of cases where actually the abuse of electoral institutions, rigging, fraud, and other forms of electoral malfeasance have actually caused massive revolutions that have been spearheaded by civil society organizations. Just to name a few, the bulldozer revolution in Serbia in 2000, the Rose Revolution in Georgia in 2003, and the kind of most famous one, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2005. All of these revolutions were led by civil society organizations, civil society movements for the most part, and they were responses to different forms of electoral abuse. And in almost all of these cases, civil society organizations were able not only to mobilize large numbers of people and get them into the streets, but also to work within existing state institutions like the judiciary, like the police, like the armed forces, like other opposition leaders to kind of enact change. So this kind of led me to ask, why don't we see civil society movements in the Middle East do the same thing? Even though, of course, we know that the abuse of electoral institutions and the manipulation of elections is just as common here as it is in many parts of the world. And again, this isn't to say that there aren't kind of responses in the Middle East. One can look to the Green Movement in Iran in 2009, the protests that took place in Egypt before the Arab Spring in 2011, after the 2010 elections there, and elsewhere. But I think in order to understand why civil society has sort of struggled to play this role, or why it in some cases has chosen not to play this role, I think that we need to understand the kind of limited cases where it has succeeded. And this is sort of what led me to want to write this case study on the Nabina Hamsa movement in Kuwait. And so just to give kind of a bit of context to the movement, and Abdullah may have covered some of this yesterday, but Kuwait is sort of a mix between a hereditary monarchy and a constitutional monarchy. There are forms of electoral participation that are tolerated in Kuwait, though of course the ruling family in Kuwait has maintained a kind of near monopoly of control over state institutions since the kind of birth of the modern state in 1961. The legislature is elected by direct secret ballot, 50 seats, and a council of ministers, the Majlis al-Wazara, sits in the parliament and sort of adds another 16 seats to those existing 50. And those ministers have the ability to vote on proposals and sort of do their own kind of politicking within the body. The modern Kuwaiti electoral system emerged in 1981 when the Kuwait National Assembly was brought back after having been dissolved unconstitutionally for about 5 years. And the sort of feeling at this moment in time, the decision to bring back the Kuwait National Assembly was sort of a response to, in large part, events in the region that were triggering domestic political agitation. So the siege of the Grand Mosque in Mecca, for example, the Iranian Revolution, the Iran-Iraq War, all of these things were leading to domestic political agitation in Kuwait, and this sort of triggered a willingness on the part of the ruling family to redirect these kind of agitators into organized parliamentary life. Of course, on top of that, a lot of new citizens in Kuwait, particularly tribal citizens or citizens who were previously sort of nomadic but had been brought in and naturalized in the 20 years prior, were given the right to participate in elections. And this sort of gave birth to a new kind of social cleavage in Kuwait that to this day is dominant. After the 1981 system was initiated, for some time, things kind of proceeded as planned, with the kind of usual complaints we hear about elections. So excessive vote buying, very small gerrymandered districts where outcomes were sort of already decided, political manipulation on the part of different government entities and actors, and just generally a feeling that elections had little meaning for the sort of the masses who were participating in them and have been participating in them for about 25 years. And so in the beginning of the 2000s, various civil society groups began to pressure members of parliament to reform the system, to institute changes to particularly the way the districts were drawn in Kuwait. Remember, there were 25, and Kuwait is a pretty small country. 25 districts is basically most of 1 to 3 neighborhoods in every district, about 2,000 to 4,000 people throughout the 1980s. And so these different movements began to agitate for political change, a redrawing of the districts, a kind of reimagining of the political system, and the sort of consolidation of these really small electoral districts into more cohesive units, which would, it was thought, make it harder to buy votes or manipulate elections and so on. The movement kind of began online, largely with bloggers who were very active in kind of publicizing the names and email addresses and SMS, the phone numbers of members of parliament, members of cabinet, and others who were active in the Kuwaiti political system, and just encouraging young people to kind of flood their phones and flood all their social media devices. Attendance at parliament was what increased rapidly in this period. Often supporters of the movement would go to parliament and actually sit in on these meetings in order to kind of get a sense of who was supportive of reform and who not, and so on. And so the movement for reform kind of reached this point in the early 2000s, in about 2005, where it became somewhat clear that nothing was going to happen. A lot of different proposals were out there. It was confusion. There was confusion. There was a proposal to limit the number of seats from 25 to 10, from 25 to 5, from 25 to 1 in the extreme case. And so this kind of chaos and confusion led many people to think that actually nothing was going to happen. And so the movement kind of persisted in this period. It continued the kind of usual tactics. It escalated and began actually protesting on the streets, and it eventually forced a closure and a dissolution of the parliament. And so what happened was, by law in Kuwait, once a parliament is dissolved, it has about 60 days to have a new election constitutionally. So then the next election sort of became all about whether or not you supported a form of reform to this existing electoral district kind of proposal that was out there. And so at that point, what's really interesting about the Nabihah Hamsa movement is that it kind of transformed from being a loose collection of online civil society actors and activists who were advocating for some sort of political change into an actual electoral interest group. And I think this is quite rare. It's quite rare to see such an effective a civil society organization or movement kind of so effectively transform itself almost overnight. Remember, there were only about 60 days, even less, I think, to actually prepare, maybe about 30 for the election. And the movement leaders were able to sort of overnight kind of flip this switch and go into districts, figure out which candidates were pro-reform and not, endorse those candidates, criticize ones who weren't. In many cases, they actually took pictures of the forms of abuses that were going on in that election. So pictures of vote buying, billboards with actual advertisements to sell votes. And they, in many ways, replaced the kind of traditional news media in terms of acting as a form of a source of information for voters who had not necessarily made up their mind or weren't really sure, right? And so these things were all very effective and allowed the movement to sort of gain this monopoly on the kind of discourse at the time about, what was the electoral issue, right? And this is also, I think, quite rare. So to summarize, the movement, Nabihah Hamsa, was able to become this successful electoral force for two reasons. First, it had credibility. It could already say that it had won something by telling people that it had actually dissolved the parliament or led to its dissolution. And second, it had a clear goal, right? It was, we want 5 districts, Nabihah Hamsa. And this really resonated with people. It was very clear what the movement wanted. It was very clear what the movement as an electoral kind of interest group wanted. And that both of these factors in turn kind of led to this success. The mobilizational capacity of the movement, what made it successful as a movement, allowed it to transform into this electoral force that I think, again, is quite rare by the standards of elections in the region. And I think if I have about a minute left, one thing.
Exactly 1 minute.
Okay, good. What I want to say is, and to address Barbara's question about whether or not this is how we can bridge the kind of old generations with the new, right? I mean, you see now in a lot of protests, the kind of leaderless so-called protests that are emerging in Iraq, in Iran, and elsewhere. These kind of stand in stark contrast to some of these movements of old, where civil society organizations, if they weren't leaders, they were involved or participants, and they were able to shape the agenda. And so what this means for elections and what this means in all the cases that you work on where civil society is maybe marginalized but still there, I leave to all of you to kind of think about, or invite you to all think about in your cases. But I think that there's a lot that can be learned from this particular case in Kuwait in terms of how to leverage an actual movement for the benefit of actual electoral change that people can sort of point to and see that it's something real. So with that, I think I'll stop. Thank you all again. I look forward to your questions and comments.
Wonderful. Well, Fatima asked me to make a few comments by way of pulling some of these threads together, and I always do what Fatima tells me to do, so I'm not going to deviate today. Almost, exactly. And one of the first points I wanted to make was really clearly illustrated just now, I think, by Daniel's great example. And that is that certainly in the last couple of years, if not prior to that, we're seeing the emergence of spontaneity, rapid response, the coalescing of a lot of disparate threads of civil society into rapid response to a moment or an opportunity. Or often, in the last couple of years, we're noting public dissatisfaction with something related to their daily lives, economic issues, or a sort of outrageous attempt by the government to pull something over on them. And if we think about that NGOization that took place maybe from 1990 through to Tunisia in 2010, one of the problems with it was not just that civil society staffed up and then you had salaries that you had to support and you needed to search for foreign funding and all of the critique that is actually well documented in the literature, but also it meant that you were far less likely to be able to shift gears and respond to opportunity. So I think one of the great things about this new generation of activism is the rapid response mentality and the spontaneity by which social media enables that kind of countrywide or even region-wide response. The other thing that really strikes me about all the cases we've been hearing about over our 2 days is that almost all of them had both gains of one type or another or losses. And often we had a very interesting dialectic in which someone would present a successful case and then tell us, but it planted the seeds for further repression, overturning of some good laws with a new constitution or whatever. But I think as of 2011, it's clear that there really is a new dynamism in place. Maybe it even extends earlier than that. If you talk to Egyptian young revolutionaries today, they will say that they failed. And certainly the West, in their discourse about the Egyptian revolution, called it a failure and continue to call it a failure. But we could have said that about the Cedar Revolution in Lebanon. It failed, right? But it didn't. It planted seeds that are now coming to fruition, and other things are happening in the interim. So I think it's too soon to judge any of these countries' situations. As depressed as we might be about Libya or Yemen or any other place, it's clear to me that we're in the middle of something very significant in our region. But certainly the dualities continue. And in state discourse, one of the ones that we've heard over and over again is that you are either loyal or neutral. That's fine. You can be apolitical or you can be loyal. But if you are acting in opposition, you are labeled a terrorist, you are labeled an outsider, there will be an attempt to take away your nationality or to somehow make you seen in the eye of the public as the enemy. And what I think is really interesting about the younger generation, and something that we need to reflect upon, is how much more difficult it is to get them to accept this ideological rhetoric that if you are an Islamist, you are the enemy because of your ideology. No, you're a terrorist if your actions are terrorist actions. But beyond that, there's a sort of refreshing refusal to use these ideological labels that were so familiar to us from the 1950s, 60s onward. The problem with demonizing is, of course, that it makes it almost impossible then to open negotiation, to have mediation, to bring disparate sides together. And what strikes me as a major shift now among civil society activists is not only this willingness to go beyond the ideological camps or tribes that might have characterized most of us, let's say in the 1960s or 70s, but to have a new, or maybe we should even say a renewed relationship to the nation. So if most of the ideologies, whether they were communism, pan-Arabism, or pan-Islamism, were regional or ignored state boundaries and hoped that they would go away, there's a new patriotism. There's a new flying of the flag in each of our revolutions, and a feeling that citizens now, who are members of that nation, want to reclaim it for themselves instead of from a tiny power elite. And if we think about how our nations mostly were formed, those were national movements. Then we moved away from that, and now I think it's a very interesting cycle coming back of reclaiming our national identity. But it is still the case, and I find this an interesting adjunct to that, that young people in particular and many of the new civil society movements are willing to take ideas from across their borders. We can hope in Egypt that some of the mistakes we made to leave the street too soon or to accept early elections before we'd really worked out the rules of the game, all of the rest of you in other countries are building on the shoulders of those successes and failures. And what this does is make it more difficult for states or political groups to demonize foreign influence or external funding or whatever it is that has been used to disparage the way civil society not only has the resource of ideas but also of funding for what it does. It leads me to think that maybe one of the really important things that we could do in a next phase of this project would be to focus in on resource allocation and resource mobilization within civil society, within our movements. We always talk about grassroots mobilization or getting funding locally. But I've worked on local philanthropy for the last decade, and it is not at all easy to get people to move from funding khairiyya to funding ethnic diversity or watchdogs or human rights or inclusive dialogues. So it's not going to be solved immediately, and it would be great if we had some further thinking about that. I think maybe I'll stop there. We also need, I think, to reconsider the security state, the role of militias and state security entities, because they're behind the scenes in all of the cases that we've looked at, even if they haven't been discussed explicitly. I thought Carmen's points yesterday were really interesting, where she talked about the need for something that mediates between the people and the street, and these state institutions that do have a hold on power, and whether the idea of revolutionary technocrats, which is being discussed here in Lebanon, could pick up steam and be something that makes sense for the rest of us to think about. So with that, I'd like to open the floor for comments, questions to any of our speakers, and we have roughly 25 minutes for that. So who would like to start? Yes. In either language, or any language.
Thank you. I think I will speak in English. I have a question to you, Doctor, from Iraq. Iraq is known as a country historically with many different kinds of ethnic groups, whether Armenians, Assyrians, Chaldeans, Mandeans, Shia, Sunni, a lot. I was wondering, we have now passed some period, a rather long period, too long in my view, where these have been split into different parts. Many have left the country and others have stayed, but still there is a big cleft between them. Are the civil society organizations divided also according to ethnic or really sectarian lines? Or is there any attempt among the civil society organizations to unite? To go back to the old days, so to say, and be a force together to, for example, to take up issues like what you mentioned is not a satisfactory article maybe in the Constitution, that everybody is equal in front of the law and so on. So if people were together, it would maybe make things simpler. Thank you.
Should we take a couple more? Mm-hmm. Yes.
Thank you very much for your presentations. سؤالي إلى دكتورة سحر. دكتورة سحر، أنهيتي حديثك بسؤال: لماذا تقوم الحكومة يعني عندها النداء لإلغاء قانون الأحوال الشخصية رغم أنه هذا القانون يوحد المجتمع العراقي؟ لماذا يحدث هذا؟ كان هذا سؤالك. بدنا احنا نسأل ونعرف من عندك لماذا تلجأ الحكومة.
يعني أنا عندي جواب، بس حبيت يعني أطرح عليكم لعل استفاد. أوكي.
أنا أنتظر الجواب، لكنه أيضا أقول تعليقي. يعني الأحزاب الإسلام السياسي وبالذات الأحزاب الشيعية اللي هي تطرح نفسها كممثلة عن الأغلبية بهذه الطريقة، تريد تقدم نفسها، تريد تشييع القوانين وتشييع المجتمع وتشييع التعليم وتحويل الدولة إلى دولة شيعية. يعني أنا تصوري هذا يمكن إذا تتفقين أو للسؤال اللي طرحتي. شكرا جزيلا.
Are there any other questions for Dr. Sahar, or maybe let's allow her to respond?
شكرا على الأسئلة، أسئلة مهمة. اسمحي لي أنه أتحدث بالعربي. يعني مؤسسات المجتمع المدني، هو أصلا المجتمع المدني من مواصفاته أنه يتجاوز الطائفية ويتجاوز القومية، وإلا ما كان مدنيا. أيضا يتجاوز الجندر. حتى عندنا بالقرآن الكريم، يعني اللي قارئ القرآن، أنه هلاك القرى وإعمار المدن دائما عامرة. حتى الرسول عليه الصلاة والسلام عندما اختار أن يبني دولته لم يبنيها في مكة، بناها في المدينة المدنية لأنها قانون، لأنها دولة، لأنها عابرة للطائفة وعابرة للقومية، يتساوى الجميع تحت ظلها. فمؤسسات المجتمع المدني هي أصلا تأسست على هذا المبدأ، مبدأ المساواة الليفل اللي تنطلق من عنده هو المواطنة والصالح العام فقط. وبالتالي مؤسسات، طبعا احنا عندنا هسه بالعراق فوق اكثر من 3400 مؤسسة مجتمع مدني تعمل في شتى قطاعات التربية والتعليم والنساء والصحة. يجون لوزارتنا حتى يسجلون، يعني المفروض يسجلون حتى يصيرون بشكل رسمي. يعني حتى لو نشوف أزيائهم مثلا اللي تلبس عباية أو المحجبة أو غير محجبة، من نجي نقرأ الورق مالتهم والشغل اللي يشتغلوا مدني، ما بأي طائفية نهائيا. لكن بس أحب يعني أنوه إلا أنه بعض المحافظات المقدسة قد يكون لها خصوصية في التحرك في المجتمع، لا أكثر ولا أقل، وإلا أنها جميعا تهدف إلى أهداف التنمية المستدامة الموجودة لحد عام 2030 الحالي، وهي جامعة للطوائف والقوميات العراقية. بالمناسبة أحب بخصوص التنوع الإثني بالعراق، التنوع الإثني بالعراق سلط عليه الضوء للأسف، مع أنه إحنا تنوعنا بسيط. يعني نحن لسنا الهند 3000 قومية، ولسنا الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية 120 طائفة وقومية. يعني إحنا بس 4 أنواع، نحن عرب وأكراد مسلمين بدرجة 84%، البقية يتنوعون بين المسيحية والديانات، لا مسيحية أكثر شيء، ثم لا يتجاوز البقية 100,000. تنوع هذا يسمى بالسياسة، بعلم السياسة تنوع بسيط، لا يرقى إلى التنوع الهائل الذي في الهند أو في الولايات المتحدة التي تبعت النهج الفيدرالي وتبعته كنظام للدولة. وبالتالي التنوع هذا البسيط أيضا أطرح تساؤل: لماذا سلط عليه هذا الضوء لكي ينظر الآخرين إلى العراق إلا أنه مشتت؟ مؤسسات المجتمع المدني جامعة يعني في عملها، لا يوجد تفرقة في كون طائفة معينة أو ديانة معينة أو قومية معينة. بالنسبة لدكتورة جنان سؤال حضرتك، طبعا أنا لعجالة الموضوع والوقت المحدد نسيت أو اتغاضيت عن سلبيات الموضوع قانون الأحوال الشخصية الجعفري، اللي ينزل من سن الزواج إلى حد 7 سنوات للطفلات، 7 سنوات، ويحرم الزوجة من أن ترث زوجها على الرغم أنه يسمح للزوج أن يرث زوجته. ثم يعود بعد ذلك ليطرح أنه المرأة تعامل سواء كانت دكتورة أو فلاحة عمرها 50 سنة أو عمرها 19 سنة نظرة القاصر، لأن وين ما تروح لازم وياها ولي أمرها. هذا القانون من تنظرين تفصيلاته دكتورة حتشوفين هناك دوافع شخصية، دوافع مادية. بعض مجموعة من الرجال الذين طلقوا زوجاتهم حابين يزوجون أخريات، ما يريدون يتخلصون من النفقة، فيريدون أطفالهم لهم حتى يخلصون من النفقة. لما تجين تبحثين عن الدوافع لتغيير هذا القانون حتجين تلقيها شخصية. بالنسبة لتغيير القوانين أو جعلها يعني شيعية أو مثل ما وصفتيها، احنا سلطنا الضوء على قانون الأحوال الشخصية وجينا القوانين المطروحة. بالمقابل أيضا يعني احنا ما نريد نحكي على المذاهب وهاي الأشياء، لكن يعني أكو الأحزاب السياسية الدينية دكتورة يعني بكل طوائفها كانت يعني لم تفي بالغرض المطلوب منها كأحزاب. يعني هي النواب المجلس النواب لو هم مؤدين دورهم بتلبية طلبات الناس والمجتمع العراقي، كان مؤسسات المجتمع المدني ما اشتغلت. مؤسسات المجتمع المدني متى تعمل دكتورة؟ تعمل عندما السلطة أو القائمين على السلطة لا يلبون احتياجات المجتمع، لا يواكبون التطور والتقدم وحاجات مجتمعهم. البرلمان المفروض هو نائب عن المجتمع، المفروض هو اللي يقدم مشاريع ليسمع الناخبين مالته، إلا أن هذا لم يحدث. وبالتالي لازم على يعني كان لزوما على مؤسسات المجتمع المدني أن تعمل بكل ألوانها. شكرا.
Okay. Other questions? Yes.
شكرا. شكرا على الورقات الجميلة. سؤالي لدانيال مسألتين. المسألة الأولى فكرة جميلة اللي تكلمت عنها، وهي إبراز المعارضين للقوانين الإصلاحية وتحديدهم يزيد الضغط المجتمعي عليهم، هذه نقطة مهمة جدا. هل هنالك أفكار أخرى استراتيجية مثل هذه الفكرة لدفع الإصلاح في البلدان العربية والإسلامية؟ أما السؤال الثاني وهو ما طرحته من سؤال، وهو هل يحق لمنظمات المجتمع المدني الدخول في السياسة، المشاركة فيها، أو الحصول على السلطة بصفة أعلى؟ أريد أن أسمع منك الجواب على هذا السؤال ومن الأستاذة باربرا. الأخت سحر، السؤال اللي تفضلت فيه، أنا فيما يظهر لي أن مسألة هدم الوحدة الوطنية في العراق هي أهم أهداف الاحتلال للسيطرة طبعا، هذا ونهب الثروات. الأمر الآخر وهو أهم من هذا طبعا عند الغرب، وهو ما يسمى بالبؤر الساخنة الجهادية لتصفية كل من يحلم في مسائل الجهاد من العرب والمسلمين في مناطق يسمونها بؤر ساخنة، يفتحوها كل 10 سنين 15 سنة في البوسنة، أفغانستان، الآن في العراق، سوريا. هذه هدفهم طبعا منها تصفية أي شخص يريد أن يعارض سيطرة الغرب على الدول الإسلامية فيما يظهر لي. هذا هو السبب الحقيقي. شكرا.
Anyone want to follow up on that, or we'll turn it back to Sahaj?
السؤال الأول موجه
Okay.
للأستاذ.
Do you want to take other?
Oh, I didn't see a hand.
Oh, okay.
Well, this is the post-lunch.
Sure.
If you're napping, just try to look like you're awake so that we don't discourage our panelists. Okay.
No, thank you for your question. I wish I had a straightforward, easy answer, but I think the reality is that most groups, and there are many different types of groups that have many different goals, political ambitions, members, it's for them to decide whether or not they want to participate in the formal political process or not. And there are many cases in the Middle East, in the region, where they have participated and they have been quite successful. And there are also cases where they have participated and they have not. Just to name a couple, for those of you who were here in Lebanon for last year's election, in many districts, civil society leaders ran on unified electoral lists. In some cases, they split the vote, and there was more than one list. But very famously, there was one list in particular, the largest civil society list, Kuluna Watani, that ran in 9 out of 15 districts and only got something like maybe 4% of the popular vote in the 9 districts they ran in, and 1 seat, right? Now, it's not for me, of course, to say that that's a failure or a success. There are, of course, all kinds of constraints to that outcome as well. There's the collusion of party elites, limiting and manipulation of the electoral threshold. There are a lot of other things that went on, but I think by most standards, and I think many people will admit that there were mistakes that were made in that campaign and a general feeling of frustration that was not adequately tapped into by those movements. I leave it for others to disagree with me if they choose. But then you have in other cases, like Iran, for example. I know that that's outside of our purview, where a number of civil society endorsed candidates actually in the last election, in the last parliamentary election in 2016, actually decided to endorse a unified list that was supported by the incumbent President Rouhani. And so what happened was many of those civil society candidates actually didn't run or left altogether. And in presidential elections, of course, they did almost the same thing. They endorsed Rouhani and withdrew from the race. And Rouhani won that presidential election with 51% of the vote, right? So that is, you could argue a case where civil society backing of a formal system candidate actually helped prevent, what those who supported that candidate would call like a greater evil, right? And again, I leave it to others to decide whether or not that's right or wrong. But there are all these examples where sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. the context matters a lot. And I think different movements have different goals or different ambitions. Some are more narrow, some are much more expansive and require a total reimagining of the state that existing institutions just could not accommodate. And so I think, you know, it really does depend. I hope I have answered your question. Thank you.
بالنسبة للأستاذ هو عقب يعني ما سأل وأنا حعقب على تعقيبه أيضا. المجتمعات المثقفة أستاذنا العزيز، المجتمعات الواعية تعليمها عالي لا يمكن لأي عدو أن يخترقها. احنا بالمجتمعات العربية يصير بينا هذه المصائب لتركنا العلم والتعليم. العلم والتعليم. بالبداية أنا حكيت يعني على أنه قانون الأحوال الشخصية وهذه الوعي بأهمية هذا القانون وبرؤيته خلى الناس يعني تصطف ويا مؤسسات المجتمع المدني. لو ما أكو وعي ما حد يصطف وياهم، وهم إيش عندهم مؤسسات المجتمع المدني؟ هم سلميين، هم سلاحهم الرأي العام والمواطنين اللي وياهم. فأركز دائما أنا مو لأن أشتغل بوزارة التربية فقط، بس لأنه التعليم هو يعني حتى الدين الإسلامي أول ما ركز على التعليم، أول ما بدأ بالتعليم والتثقيف يعني. وأرجع وأقول أن الديانات كلها جاءت لخدمة الإنسان ومصلحته أيا كانت الديانة. نحن نتوحد في إنسانيتنا، كل الديانات تأتي لمصلحة الإنسان فقط. نقطة راس سطر. شكرا.
Maybe I could just add to that something slightly different, but I think related, an example from Egypt immediately after 2011, when presidential elections were announced and the Muslim Brotherhood, which is our best organized Islamist group, of course, made a decision and told everyone that they were not going to run a candidate. But inside that group, there were individuals who felt that was a mistake. It was a new moment, it was an opportunity for Egypt. And one of those individuals, Abdelminam Abu Fattur, announced his intention as an individual using his citizen's right to run for president in Egypt. The result, of course, was that he was banned from the MB as an organization. And then they turned around and decided that they would, in fact, run candidates. They ran someone that towed their organizational party line. But what was interesting about this example to me, what really struck me was from the most secular revolutionaries who'd been extremely active throughout the 18 days of the Egyptian uprising, many of them, instead of supporting a secular candidate, offered to campaign and to lead the movement for his election. And their reason was this: a liberal Islamist has the best chance of unifying Egypt in the coming days from this division, this bifurcation that has harmed us as a country. And of course, he didn't get a high percent. It's the same problem that we often have when popular opinion needs time to understand the importance of that kind of unity. But it was a really lovely example, and some of these secular leaders took a lot of flack from their constituencies as well. But I think we all learned something from the process. And just as a side note, Abu Fattur has been in prison now for almost 2 years. His health is very bad. He's paid a very high price for his country. Any other comments? Questions? Yes, at the back.
طبعا أنا استمعت إلى حديث الزميلة الدكتورة سحر وقرأت ورقتها لأكثر من مرة، بس في نقطة مهمة يجب التأكيد عليها أمام الملأ، أنه النائبات من الكتل الإسلامية في البرلمان العراقي كانوا يؤيدون هذا القانون أكثر من الرجال. أنا البارحة قلت على هذه المنصة، قلت النساء أكثر نشاطا من الرجال، لكن هذه النقطة يجب أن لا تغفليها، لأنه إحنا إزاء مسؤولية أكاديمية في هذا الموضوع. وأيضا المجتمع المدني العراقي نفسه لا يخلو من السلبية ولا يخلو من المحاصصة. والبارحة قلت أنه إحنا عندنا 4 مجتمعات يعني، فأيضا بعض المنظمات المجتمع المدني العراقي وقفت مؤيدة إلى هذا القانون. فينبغي لا أكو فينبغي إحنا إزاء مسؤولية أكاديمية. المنظمات المرتبطة بالأحزاب السياسية يعني خلينا نقول الدينية بكل أطيافها بكل أشكالها تسعى من أجل تقويض قانون الأحوال الشخصية المدني. شكرا جزيلا.
Okay, we're going to have an Iraq discussion. Let's microphone down here.
شكرا جزيلا. أحب أشارك رأيي بالموضوع اللي طرحتيه حول المنظمات المجتمع المدني، وفيما إذا كانت منقسمة طائفيا أو دينيا أو قوميا. جوابي هو نعم، منقسمة حسب المنظمات. أنا أطروحتي على منظمات المجتمع المدني الشيعية، فيعني عندي خبرة بالمنظمات وكيف متوزعة على الأحزاب وعلى الطوائف وعلى القوميات. نعم، هم يقولون أنه يخدمون الجميع، ومن المؤكد حين يقدمون أوراقهم للتسجيل يقدموها بأفضل صيغ ممكنة، وبأنه أكيد يعني ما به أي تفرقة، لكنه السيرفيسز والخدمات اللي يقدموها للناس قائمة من أجل جذب المخدومين. وبالغالب المنظمات اللي مرتبطة بأحزاب، ودائما يعني نسبة كبيرة هي مرتبطة بالأحزاب، وبالذات الأحزاب اللي بالسلطة عندها أهداف 3 في آن واحد. هدف بالتأكيد تقدم شيء خيري حتى تنال رضا الشخص المستلم، وأيضا عندها دور اجتماعي، بمعنى إذا كانت المنظمة إسلامية تحاول تخلي الشخص المستلم يتصرف بطريقة إسلامية، وأيضا عندها جانب سياسي، لما يحين وقت الانتخابات تضمن هذا الشخص عنده ولاء سياسي وعنده تصويت. فبلذلك المنظمات تخدم الكوميونيتي، المجتمع المحلي مالتها، لأنه إذا كانت منظمة شيعية ما تتوقع أنه الشيعي راح يعطي صوت إلى حزب سني، وإذا كان من منظمة سنية ما يتوقعون أنه راح يعطي صوت الواحد من طائفة شيعية، وإذا كان كردي ما ينطي العربي والعربي. وهو هذا أساسا مشروع المحاصصة، هو كل فكرة مشروع المحاصصة. فلذلك بالتأكيد المنظمات لما تقدم أوراقها تبدو كأنما إيجابية، لكنه بالواقع العملي عندها أهداف ثلاثية. وهذا الشيء اللي ينطبق يعني أكثر المنظمات اللي عندها حظ واللي تحسدها المنظمات العلمانية الإمكانيات المالية اللي عندها، لأنها ممولة طبعا. وهذا الأمر ما ينطبق على العراق، ينطبق على لبنان، وينطبق على كل مكان من الولايات المتحدة إلى في كتاب 2 بروفيسور هسه ما أتذكر أسمائهم كتبوا عن الأدوار الثلاثة للمنظمات المرتبطة بالأحزاب أو التيارات السياسية الدينية، إذا كانت مسيحية، بروتستانتية، كاثوليكية، يهودية، مسلمة، الكل يتبعون نفس البرنامج. وهؤلاء البروفيسورين حصلوا جائزة عالمية على كتابهم. شكرا. إذا مو حالة عراقية خاصة، حالة عالمية.
اوكي، بس هي بشكل رسمي والساحة اللي تتحرك عليها متساوي، ماكو. هي اصلا مثلا تيجي على مود تسوي تعليم، اوكي، ايا كان هذا التعليم انت حتستفادين منه كمواطنه، سواء سويته بهاي المحافظه او بهاي الطائفه كمواطن. لكن انا قلت المحافظات الدينيه لها خصوصيه. اما تعقيبا على كلام الدكتور استاذنا دكتور عماد، فاني اقول انه احنا بدنا نحكي على الموضوع اللي اشتغلت عليه هذا البحث ما نحكي على الناس اللي هم اصلا يعتبرون بس بالاسم مؤسسات مجتمع مدني، هم تابعين لاحزاب معينه. احنا انا ما ادخل هاي الفئه بمؤسسات المجتمع المدني، هي توابع لاحزاب سياسيه تعكس اجندتهم، احنا ما نحكي. وطبعا انا بس قلت النائبات المدنيات اللي اصطفن ويا هذا الموضوع وتظاهرن ويانا، بعضهم حتى في مناصب حكوميه. اي طبعا اشجع جدا انه مؤسسات المجتمع المدني تعمل مع الحكومه. شكرا.
I wonder if anyone has questions for Sharifa. Let's let this one take a rest for a minute. If not, Sharifa, are you still with us? Yes? Have we lost Sharifa?
No, I'm right here. Sorry, it was on mute.
Okay. I wanted to ask you, you made the really interesting point about how powerful the arts had been in places like Egypt, when officially it was almost impossible for citizens to have overtly political activities, that the expressions they could use through the arts were actually helping to keep civic spirit and civic skills alive. And I'm wondering if you're seeing that elsewhere in the region, and if there has been research on the role of the arts and civil society mobilization.
So I have a friend who's actually writing a paper. Her name is Abrara Shimmeri. For her master's thesis, she focused on art as something that is expressing the needs, desires, kind of the importance of the issue of Badoon in Kuwait. And so she's looking at that case study. And so we're slowly seeing this kind of shift in the literature as to these micro ways in which we can keep kind of the spirit alive.
Great. I think we need to wrap this session up. And given that we're sitting in Lebanon and we've had a really vibrant discussion about politics, religion, and the role of religion in public life, I just want to mention an anecdote from about 10 years ago when I was doing research on local philanthropy. And I was interviewing someone here in Lebanon who said that during the previous parliamentary election campaign, this individual had gone to a Christian village up in the Shuf somewhere, in which there was actually a printed list. And it said, for $150 given to repair our steeple, you will get this many votes. For $250 to $400 to work on the nave of our church, you can have this many votes. And it was like a flyer that they had ready for anyone who came around. So I know that's a lighter note, and it's not the way we want to run elections in the Arab world, but it kind of tells you how far we still have to move for there to be a real awareness of the difference between civic action, services that are social and humanitarian in nature, and the political processes that we all want to see changed. And I think when a moment of change happens, everything becomes political and everyone becomes political. So this isn't something we're going to resolve by 4 o'clock. So I think it's time to thank our speakers and to let you all go to a coffee break.
Thank you.